the $3 trillion throttle, who controls the world's supply chain. The tanker's engines died mid-channel, and the captain's voice cracked across the radio. Traffic stopped. AIS screens lit red as icons stacked into a solid wall. In Singapore, a refinery hedger hit by. Oil futures jumped before anyone knew why. Berths from Busan to Chennai flashed delay advisories. In 1 hour, the most crowded seam in global trade felt like it had seized. To understand why a narrow, shallow corridor can jolt markets in minutes, we need to go back. This strait feeds a continent's factories and lights its cities. The question isn't if it can be throttled, but who can turn the hand. The choke point that feeds Asia. At first light, pilots climb steel ladders as deckhands steady heaving lines. Bulkers, boxships and tankers nose into formation, bows pointed toward a corridor that looks generous on a map and tight through a bridge window. The Strait of Malacca isn't just busy, it's geometric pressure. Depth shoals to the high 20s of meters near its southeast reaches, forcing big hulls to trim drafts and thread the marked lanes. Two highways drawn in water, separated by a median that's more suggestion than space. Every day, hundreds of captains ask the same question. Can we make our tide window without risking a scrape on a sill? Meanwhile, planners ashore are running a different calculation. Can Asia make next week's energy burn if today's traffic hiccups? For Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore, this is the artery that keeps turbines spinning and factory shifts steady. Middle Eastern crude rides east. LNG rides with it. Containers stacked 9 high carry the smaller lifeblood, chips, fabrics, bearings, toys, that turn orders into shelf stock. The numbers feel abstract until you put them in motion. Imagine 200 ships forming a conga line through a space that narrows, shallows, and bends. Each one has a pilot window, a berth slot, and a delivery promise. Break one link and the chain tenses. Break two and it whips. The strait bears roughly a quarter to a third of global seaborne trade value when you include the South China Sea connection. What matters here is exposure. A large share of China's imported oil and gas crosses this corridor. Japan and Korea lean even harder on seaborne energy. When flows hesitate, refinery margins spike, and utility dispatchers reach for coal plants they'd rather not fire. That tension shows up in human routines. In Singapore, vessel traffic controllers work a mosaic of AIS plots, radar sweeps, and radio voices. One slip, an engine cough, a fouled prop, a steering gear alarm, and the separation scheme becomes a jigsaw puzzle. Tug crews roll from one assist to the next, half their job choreography, half improvisation. In Port Klang, schedulers stare at spreadsheets that turn red with every hour of upstream slippage, knowing a single late mothership blows up a week's worth of feeder planning. Meanwhile, insurance desks price fear in real time. A rumor of piracy upticks, a fog bank, a monsoon squall tightening visibility, the premium ticks up. Operators decide whether to wait at anchor, risk the transit, or swing south for Lombok and accept the extra days, fuel, and crew overtime. None of those choices are good, some are just less bad. The geometry explains the stakes. Draft limits squeeze the biggest crude carriers. Tidal windows are precise, especially near the eastern approaches. Crosscurrents and haze complicate approaches to the bends and banks. And because the strait feeds into the Singapore Strait's even tighter passages, the system behaves like a queue inside a queue. When the head slows, the tail barely moves. Energy makes the corridor's dependence unforgiving. LNG cargoes are schedules on a clock. Terminals expect them in sequence. Power demand swings with heat waves, and storage tanks by hours, not weeks. When a few LNG ships divert to deeper straits, regas terminals shuffle arrival slots, utilities ramp pricier fuels, and spot prices leap. The same dynamic hits oil refineries. Crude slates aren't interchangeable overnight, and a delay forces run cuts or costly swaps. On deck, mariners adapt. Pilots talk in shorthand, swapping intel on set and drift at 1 fathom bank or haze patches off Dumai. Captains rehearse blackout drills because they've seen what happens to a 300-meter dead ship in a live lane. The quiet heroics live in seconds. A tug captain deciding to push before being asked. A pilot catching a knot drop in speed and calling for more helm. A bosun throwing a line that lands on target at first swing. Factories far away feel those seconds as days. A late vessel means customs clearance shifts, truckers miss slots, production lines switch to buffer stock. If buffers are thin, as they often are, supervisors post overtime and CFOs approve air freight for critical parts. Multiply that across electronics assemblers in the Pearl River Delta, auto plants in Thailand, and appliance makers in Vietnam, and the Strait's twitch becomes a region's heartbeat. There's an alternate path for nearly everything at sea, but here alternates carry penalties. You can swing to Sunda or Lombok, but you pay in distance, fuel, and congestion that migrates. You can build inventories on land, but you pay in cash idling on shelves. You can hedge cargoes and charters, but you pay in premiums that don't move steel an inch faster. So the system squeezes efficiency from the margins it still controls. Better pilotage, tighter traffic management, disciplined bunkering, quick turnarounds. Singapore has built a reputation on those gains, and its neighbors steward their stretches with patrols and practical rules. That patchwork works until multiple variables go wrong at once. And it's not just mechanics and economics. There's an anxiety that lives in strategy rooms. Planners give it a name, the Malacca dilemma. If a corridor so central can be slowed by fog and engine failure or a single grounded giant, what happens if someone decides to test its limits on purpose? That question isn't melodrama. It's the shadow under every routine, the reason pilots rehearse, controllers coordinate, and operators hedge. Because this choke point doesn't just feed Asia. It keeps the global clock on time. Rewind how Malacca became the world's lane. To understand why the lane feels inevitable today, we need to roll back to when wind set the schedule. For centuries, monsoon rhythms stitched the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Traders learned the cadence, ride the northeast monsoon west to Aden and Hormuz, return on the southwest winds toward Malacca. The Malacca Sultanate sat at the hinge, taking tolls, brokering safe passage, and translating between worlds. Spices, silks, ceramics, and stories crossed here because the geography made it easy and the politics made it profitable. Then cannons and caravels arrived. The Portuguese wanted the hinge for themselves, and they took it, turning pilotage into power and customs into coercion. The Dutch followed with companies that acted like states. The British learned the lesson and built a system, charts, lighthouses, rules, and a port that would become Singapore. Control of the strait shifted from seasonal trust to codified authority. What started as a wind road turned into an administered lane. Steam engines broke the wind calendar. Ships no longer waited for monsoons, and the strait's promise short, sheltered, direct tightened its pull. Coal depots dotted the route. Telegraph cables stitched ports into a network. By the time crude oil mattered more than pepper, the path was already baked into logistics. War and empire made it strategic. Profit made it permanent. World War II and the collapse of empires scrambled who held the keys, but not where the hallway ran. New states, Indonesia, Malaya, then Malaysia and Singapore, claimed sovereignty over the coasts and the seabed. International lawyers codified freedoms and limits. UNCLOS put names to transit rights and responsibilities. The littoral states inherited an asset and a burden, manage a global artery while protecting local waters and people. They coordinated pilotage zones, patrolled against piracy, and built institutions to make a crowded passage workable. Meanwhile, Asia changed the scale. Japan's post-war boom turned tankers east. Korea's rise and Taiwan's factories added volume. China's opening flipped the math entirely. The region didn't just consume energy, it became the workbench of the world. Containerization took the old trade and multiplied it. A standardized steel box made distance cheaper and time more predictable. Ports like Singapore, Port Klang, Tanjung Pelepas, and Penang expanded berths, dredged channels, and bought cranes that could turn ships in hours, not days. Each improvement attracted more calls. Each new service pinned another schedule to the strait. The strait's physics never changed. Depths in the southeast remained shallow by big tanker standards. Bends and banks stayed tricky, but technology kept pushing vessels larger, squeezing efficiency out of scale. So operators learned to live with the constraint. Lighter loads on very large crude carriers, tighter timing through the approaches, more pilots, better tugs. The compromise worked because the payoff, direct access to Asia's industrial coastline, was massive. Along the way, the idea of control kept evolving. The Portuguese and British imagined forts and flags. Post-colonial managers built procedures and partnerships. In the 200s, when piracy surged, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand tightened patrols and shared information. Incidents dropped, and the message landed. This lane would be kept open by coordination, not by any single navy claiming ownership. That distinction matters. It created a habit of cooperation that most days keeps chaos at bay. But growth had its own gravity. As China's refineries multiplied and its utilities leaned on gas, the share of energy threaded through Malacca climbed. Japan and Korea stayed exposed by geography. Southeast Asia's own demand rose, adding local stakes to global flows. The strait became not just a route, but a regional dependency. Every refinery upgrade, every new import terminal, every factory cluster made the lane harder to replace. Onshore, Singapore built an ecosystem around reliability, world-class vessel traffic control, bunkering capacity, shipyards, and financial services that priced risk and fuel in the same skyline. Up the coast, Malaysian ports captured feeders and mainline calls. Across the water, Indonesian authorities balanced sovereignty with service, fishing with shipping. Not perfect, never simple, but functional enough that shippers could bet production schedules on it. Meanwhile, law and precedent shaped expectations. Transit passage meant the world could flow through without asking permission as long as ships behaved. That bargain, freedom for compliance, helped globalize supply chains with confidence. The same rules that made the lane open also made it vulnerable. If everyone can use it, everyone depends on everyone else to use it well. By the 201s, the strait was baked into business plans. Contracts assumed transit times. Just-in-time inventories assumed reliability. Energy hedges assumed ships would clear the narrows on schedule. The risks were known: groundings, haze, squalls, crime, but they felt managed until moments when they didn't. Each near miss and every brief stoppage reminded planners of the historical arc. A wind road, militarized and then standardized, turned into a throughput machine that leaves no slack. That's how Malacca became the world's lane. Geography set the path, empire enforced it, law normalized it, and Asia's rise locked it in. The traffic density kept climbing, the margins kept thinning, and the payoff kept justifying the bet. Which brings us back to the anxiety in those strategy rooms. When a lane is built on coordination across rivals and neighbors, the past proves something comforting and something fragile at the same time. The physics of vulnerability. Stand on a bridge wing at dusk, and the strait looks calm, almost generous. The trap lives under the surface. Bathymetry sets the rules long before policy does. South and east, toward the Singapore Strait, depths drop into the high 20s of meters. Shoals and banks, mud, silt, sand, shift subtly with tide and monsoon, moving the margins that big hulls need. The channel becomes a series of sill points, invisible thresholds where a meter of extra draft turns from inconvenience to grounding risk. A VLCC can pass, but rarely full. A few centimeters on a tide table can decide whether captain proceeds or waits. Those weights compress into tidal windows. Semidiurnal tides push and pull from both ends, colliding in the middle with ranges that stretch from 1.5 meters to nearly 4 around 1 fathom bank. Currents accelerate where the strait constricts, a gentle drift turning into a set strong enough to walk a behemoth sideways. In the northeast monsoon, fresher river plumes lower salinity along the Malaysian coast, layering water and softening visibility in haze season. In the southwest monsoon, Indian Ocean water pushes north, sharpening salinity gradients and changing how a ship responds to rudder and prop. On the surface, captains see it as a sequence of handling problems. We're making 10 knots good, but feel that push, a pilot might say, eyes tracking a buoy that seems to slide. A degree more helm, a touch more throttle, a correction planned 10 seconds earlier than instinct would suggest. Now add visibility. Haze drops the horizon to a smudge smoke from burning season or a dense squall line rolling off Sumatra. Radar paints returns, AIS plots show intentions, but the human brain still wants eyes on steel when two ships meet at a bend. Traffic separation schemes are the choreography that makes this tolerable. Northbound and southbound lanes, separation zones, reporting points, STRTAP stitching radios into a chorus, but even good choreography breaks if one dancer stumbles. One engine failure in a lane with minimal shoulder turns every other ship into a decision point. A dead ship at 8 degrees of rudder goes where the set takes it. Tugs are minutes away if they're lucky, longer if they're busy. Meanwhile, pilots up channel start spacing out, slowing approaches to create time, and the queue grows like a tide of its own. Piracy in its old, violent form isn't the daily fear it once was, but the legacy it left matters. Ships slow in known hotspots, extra lookouts stare into the dark, and some captains hold more sea room when they can. Every safety margin taken for people reduces the margin available for handling. Small boats darting between bulbous bows aren't just a security concern. They're a collision hazard that forces a 300-meter hull into a maneuver that eats precious lateral space. Certain stretches act like single-point failure zones. Picture grounded tanker at a narrow bend where shoals press the lanes inward. Now look at the angles. If the bow or stern sits at just the wrong orientation, it can intrude into both traffic streams. The official scheme still exists on paper, but in water it's blocked by steel. Salvos arrive, but it's not a fender bender. Soft seabeds can swallow anchors. Refloating takes time, tide cycles, and horsepower that has to be summoned from hours away. In those hours, the queue lengthens and spreads upstream to see anchors and downstream to anchorage constraints near Singapore. Is the human heartbeat beneath the hydraulics? Pilots run on fatigue edges when weather compresses windows. One missed crew change ripples through rest plans. A tugmaster who's done 5 assists in shifting crosswinds now faces a disabled container ship drifting across the lane with 4 meters under keel and falling tide. He doesn't have an hour to discuss it. He has seconds to commit, with a line that might part if the angle is wrong. The physics of wire under load don't care about charter parties. Meanwhile, opportunists watch density. Low-level thieves prefer anchored ships, but congestion creates anchored ships. A few boarded at night won't shut the lane, yet they add a layer of caution. Insurance adjusters looking at incident logs nudge premiums upward. A master who would have pressed on at dusk now waits until dawn. That single choice feels prudent and is, but multiplied across dozens of vessels, it becomes a measurable slowdown. Electronics help until they don't. AIS gives intent, radar shows targets, ECDIS plots safe water, but spoofed positions, miskeyed drafts, outdated depth surveys in dynamic sediment zones, the digital layer inherits the uncertainty beneath. Mariners know the IHO caveat, charted depths have confidence intervals. In a place where sand moves, yesterday's safe contour might be today's scrape. All of this invites strategy because physics limits options. You can't wish more depth into a sill point or widen a bend overnight. So planners build buffers elsewhere, tug availability, salvage contracts on retainer, shared patrols to deter crime, drills for blackouts and steering failures. It's resilience by layers, but layers have seams. When monsoon haze meets a blackout meets a tight tide, the seam shows. And when the seam shows in a corridor this central, the vulnerability isn't theoretical. It's a countdown that everyone in the chain can hear. The Malacca dilemma, China's strategic anxiety. From Beijing's perspective, the strait isn't a map feature, it's a pulse check. Every morning, energy planners pull up flow dashboards and see a number that won't go away. Most of the crude that feeds China's refineries and a large share of the LNG that keeps peakers humming crosses Malacca. That exposure creates a constant itch. Whether accidents, crime, they matter. But the fear with a capital F is agency. What happens if someone slows the lane on purpose? The phrase landed 2 decades ago. Hu Jintao called it the Malacca dilemma, and the term never left the room. It meant more than blockade fantasies. It meant vulnerability to any constraint China couldn't quickly influence, legal pretexts, inspection regimes, or a string of incidents that add up to delay. The Navy's blue water push grew partly out of that anxiety. If you can't own the corridor, at least be present enough to complicate anyone else's plan. Presence looks like layers. Escort missions that start as anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden become habit on the sea lanes. Access agreements at friendly ports stretch resupply ranges. A maritime militia shadows fishing grounds and watches chokepoints. Intelligence ships listen. Everything signals, we're here, and we care about what flows east. But care isn't control. Geography gives India a balcony over the Western Gate, Andaman and Nicobar. The United States and partners keep ships and aircraft moving in the region under the banner of navigation freedoms. The littoral states own the shoreline, run the traffic systems, and coordinate patrols. China can't dictate outcomes in waters it doesn't administer. That's the dilemma, stripped of rhetoric, a critical artery where dependence outruns influence. So hedges sprout on land. Pipelines from Myanmar feed into Yunnan, pushing crude and gas across mountains to reduce sea exposure by a sliver. The capacity helps, but it's no substitute for tanker volumes, and the corridor lives in a rough political neighborhood. Rail corridors across Eurasia carry high-value containers, not energy in bulk. Even grand ideas like a canal across Thailand's isthmus or land bridges with double-stacked trains run into ecological, financial, and diplomatic walls. The math keeps pointing back to sea. In the energy bureaus, planners model pain. How many days could refineries run on reserves if flows hiccup? Which coastal provinces could switch to coal if gas is late? And how fast would prices spike? They run scenarios where LNG diversions jam alternative straits, or where a subtle tightening of security checks near the eastern approaches turns a day's transit into two. The results aren't apocalyptic, but they're ugly. Higher costs, rationed flows, scrambled schedules, and a political headache that radiates into factories and cities. The military staff write parallel memos. A far blockade is hard to sustain and risky to attempt, but a Grayzone slow roll, electronic interference, administrative friction, selective harassment could achieve delay without a declaration. Countering that means escorts, convoys, and diplomatic cover, all inside waters where other navies already operate and where local authorities set the tone. Missteps risk escalation with states Beijing would rather not alienate. Oversteps create blowback that closes doors elsewhere. Inside Chinese shipping companies, the dilemma turns into routing calls and insurance clauses. Do you pay a premium to send a few VLCCs via Lombok during a scare, eating fuel and time to buy certainty? Do you stock more crude onshore and tie up capital? Do you sign longer-term LNG contracts with Qatari flexibility and accept higher prices for security of delivery? Each answer bleeds margin to buy resilience, a trade the market tolerates only until competitors do the same and pass costs downstream. Meanwhile, the littoral states matter in ways Beijing can't ignore. Singapore's disciplined neutrality stabilizes the narrowest stretch. Malaysia and Indonesia balance sovereignty with service, and their patrols keep low-level crime from becoming systemic risk. If Beijing leans too hard, it invites resistance. If it leans too little, it lives with exposure. Hence the quiet courtship, port investments, training offers, technology gifts, and a promise, spoken carefully, not to turn cooperation into control. There's another layer: legal. UNCLOS guarantees transit passage, but security is elastic when threats are invoked. Beijing watches how the language is stretched elsewhere. Inspections in the Black Sea, drone strikes in the Red Sea prompting naval escorts, sanctions policing that rides on maritime law. If those tools migrate into Southeast Asia, even for good faith reasons, they could be used against Chinese cargoes in a crisis. That's the nightmare, a rules-based slowdown that looks legitimate to everyone except the shipper who can't meet a contract. In backrooms, the conclusion keeps circling back to the same sentence. The strait is safe when everyone needs it, and vulnerable when someone decides they need leverage more. China's response is to reduce unilateral levers, build redundant storage, diversify suppliers, nurture alternatives, and show up at sea. It's a strategy of friction reduction rather than dominance, because dominance is off the table. Yet the anxiety isn't uniquely Chinese. Tokyo's energy ministry watches the same flows. Seoul's utilities track the same LNG berths. Taipei's importers live inside the same geography. Southeast Asia is increasingly a consumer, not just a conduit. The shared dependence creates an incentive to keep politics from infecting pilotage. It also creates a blunt truth that planners in Beijing accept even if they don't say it aloud. Keeping Malacca open is a coalition task, and coalitions are messy. That's the heart of the dilemma, not a single switch someone could flip, but a dashboard full of sliders no one operator controls. Beijing can move a few and nudge a few others, but not all, not fast, not without cost. So the hedge becomes the doctrine, invest, diversify, attend, and hope that coordination outpaces fear on the days when the strait's physics and politics collide. The Gatekeepers, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. On paper, 3 flags frame the strait. In practice, 3 sets of instincts manage it hour by hour. Singapore thinks like an operator. Malaysia thinks like a steward of coastlines and people. Indonesia thinks like an archipelago that's seen everything from tsunamis to smugglers. Together, they run a corridor the world assumes will work. Jurisdiction here is a mosaic. Territorial seas hug each coast, exclusive economic zones stretch out, and the lanes that matter most are governed by rules every captain knows by heart. UNCLOS gives transit passage. The littoral states set the conditions that keep transit safe. That balance, freedom with obligations, requires more choreography than it sounds. Singapore's advantage isn't size, it's discipline. In a dark room pulsing with radar sweeps, controllers manage STAITAP like air traffic control for steel. Reporting points aren't suggestions. Pilotage is a craft the island has turned into a brand. Mariners talk about the cadence on the radio, the clarity of instructions, the predictability of tugs appearing exactly when the pilot wants them. Bunkering is its own ecosystem, hundreds of suppliers, standardized checks, quality control that reduces bad fuel surprises that can kill an engine at the worst bend. A micro-story lives in the dockside routines. A pilot on the midnight watch sips lukewarm coffee, scanning a stack of scheduled transits. One vessel reports a flicker on a steering alarm. He moves 2 others a mile back without drama, calls a tug that was fueling to stand by, and the hiccup never becomes a headline. It's competence as safety net, paid forward 100 times a day. Across the water, Malaysia manages a longer shoreline with more variables. Port Klang's schedulers juggle mother ships and feeders, fishing skiffs hugging the coast, and coastal towns that see the strait as workplace, not abstraction. Environmental officers remember spills that stained mangroves and pay attention when a tanker's AIS shows erratic speed near sensitive zones. Fisheries officials argue for gear protection. Sovereignty isn't an abstract. When foreign navies transit, Kuala Lumpur watches tone and behavior closely. Malaysia's enforcement crews run lean. Patrol craft sweep known boarding spots at night, check permits, and radio warnings when fog banks settle. The aim isn't to militarize the corridor, it's to keep low-level theft from breeding confidence among bigger gangs. When haze season arrives, they coordinate with port authorities on speed advisories that slow transits through the murk without turning the lane into a parking lot. Indonesia brings scale and memory. Sumatra's eastern coast faces the highway, but the state's attention has to stretch across thousands of islands. Local commanders know the inshore currents by smell and the smugglers by patterns. They've chased fuel siphoners who treat anchored ships as floating ATMs. They've pulled fishermen off sandbars where shoals creep year to year. They also guard against illegal dumping that kills fisheries communities rely on. Every enforcement choice weighs livelihood against law. Together, the 3 run the Malacca Strait patrols, surface craft, eyes in the sky, and an information-sharing spine. It's not a glossy alliance. It's a working relationship that cuts serious piracy from headlines to footnotes over the last 2 decades. The routine is simple. If a fast skiff runs from one jurisdiction, the next patrol picks up the chase. If a suspicious boarding happens at anchor off Dumai, Singapore's watch floor knows within minutes, and insurance underwriters adjust their models quietly rather than pulling alarms. But coordination has seams. Maritime boundaries aren't everywhere clean. Fishermen cross lines out of habit, not malice. A haze plume blows from land fires and becomes a diplomatic irritant. A patrol boat radios a warning an American captain reads as brusque. A Chinese research vessel lingers in ways that feel like mapping. Little frictions accumulate in an environment where one curt word on a bridge-to-bridge channel can spiral into a domestic talking point. Even so, the stabilizer effect is real. Singapore invests in simulators where pilots from all 3 states drill emergency tows and blackout recoveries. Malaysia hosts tabletop exercises on spill response that pull in port authorities and coast guards from both neighbors. Indonesia opens airfields for shared maritime patrol flights. The message is practical. We don't have to like everything about each other's policies to keep steel moving safely. The politics never disappear. Kuala Lumpur has constituencies that bristle at outside navies flexing near their coasts. Jakarta guards its sovereignty with a fierceness born of geography. Singapore guards its neutrality like capital, husbanded and deployed with intention. When global powers stage drills or send transits that feel performative, the gatekeepers close ranks, quietly reminding everyone whose home this is. Yet the gatekeepers also know the price of overreach. A heavy-handed inspection regime could slow ships and push business toward rivals. Overly strict bunkering rules without coordination could scatter fueling to less regulated ports, inviting exactly the engine failures everyone fears. A refusal to share incident data could spike insurance and trigger reroutes that bypass local pilots and tug companies. The sweet spot is vigilance without vanity. There's a moment that repeats often. A tired master calls on VHF, accent thick, stress obvious. Pilot, we're experiencing fluctuations on main engine. The reply from the shore is calm, rehearsed, human. Understood, reduce speed to safe. Tugs are on the way. In those 10 words lives the quiet authority of 3 states that, despite every grievance and headline, keep a promise to the world. The lane will be open tomorrow. That promise isn't a treaty text, it's behavior. It's why shipowners pay to time their arrivals to the tide. It's why charterers accept clauses that mention STITAP. It's why insurers discount premiums when patrol stats improve. And it's why, when a spark hits this corridor, global navies may show up. But the first voices on the radio belong to Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, deciding where the next tow lane goes. The shadow threat: piracy, smuggling, sabotage. When traffic slows, small boats appear like punctuation marks in the gaps. The old nightmare, machetes on ladders, crews march to the bow, has mostly faded here, but a quieter threat took its place. Low, fast skiffs slide alongside anchored ships at 2 in the morning. A deck light flickers, a lookout blinks, and a hose snakes into a manifold. Fuel siphoned by the ton looks like nothing in a gauge and everything in a ledger. Spare parts vanish. A bosun's locker opens and closes. By daybreak, the thieves are nets and tarps again. Stakes live in those small losses. A siphoned ton of fuel means a generator that coughs later, a schedule that slips by hours, a crew argument about reporting that invites a claim and an inspection. Masters weigh the risk of advertising vulnerability versus dealing with it quietly. Insurers watch the pattern and adjust premiums half a point. In a corridor where margins already run thin, half a point multiplies fast. Action looks like nighttime choreography. Anchored ships run extra watches. Radar ranges narrow to filter clutter and pull small targets out of sea noise. Patrol craft loop the anchorage edges, spotlights cutting white arcs on black water. A captain who hears feet on deck kills lights, lays on the horn, and sends the crew to a safe room drill they practiced for weeks and hoped never to use. Most nights, the intruders melt away at the hint of attention. On the bad nights, a knife flashes, a seafarer takes a scrape, and a report hits 3 desks before dawn. Impact lands in policy and behavior. P&I clubs raise deductibles for certain anchorages. Charterers start asking for arrival windows that avoid the deepest hours of night. Port authorities stretch patrol rotations and push for better lighting at anchor. The crime stays small scale, but the system feels it as drag. Smuggling wears a different face. The strait's density is cover. Fast launches dart between legitimate traffic, carrying subsidized fuel, untaxed cigarettes, wildlife, or people trying to disappear into a container yard. The stakes here aren't just money, they're a sovereignty and safety. Smugglers cut across bows, force sudden course changes, and pull tragedies in their wake. A Navy coxswain who grew up on these currents recognizes the hum of an outboard by make and year and gives chase, not to wage a war, but to keep a corridor usable. Action threads through informal intelligence. A ferry crew radios a registration number in a whisper. A fisherman points wordlessly toward a channel at dusk. A patrol boat throttles up, stern digs in, and green water sprays. When they intercept, the cargo might be jerrycans and hope, or it might be a crate that changes hands with a shrug and a promise that no one believes. Paper trails rarely match wakes. Impact shows up as trust or its absence. When patrols interdict without humiliating, communities talk. When enforcement turns theatrical, Tips dry up and the fast boats get bolder. Ports crack down on yard access, contractors get background checked twice, and innocent delays stack on the guilty ones. The line between necessary vigilance and punitive friction is thin and tested daily. Sabotage is the word nobody likes to say on the radio. Mines are cheap, drones are cheaper. A slow, uncrewed quadcopter brushing a bridge wing at night won't sink a ship, but it will stop one, and in this lane a pause becomes a wave. The stakes here are systemic. A few well-placed devices, or even credible reports of them, can trigger caution strong enough to slow 1,000 hulls. Action in a sabotage scare is all about procedure. A harbor master gets a call about a suspicious object near a buoy. The response plan activates without drama: cordon, inspect, clear. Divers roll in, drones launch, and tugboats create a perimeter. Radios switch to clip tempo. Meanwhile, AIS shows a ring of ships holding position. The choreography has been practiced. The clock doesn't care. Each hour of investigation becomes 2 hours of queue growth. Impact reaches markets by lunchtime. A spike in risk ratings moves freight rates, not because steel is damaged, but because time is. LNG carriers watching the delay choose deeper water elsewhere, reshaping slot plans across a continent. Oil traders make calls. Refinery dispatchers reshuffle blend plans. The anchor point of a rumor moves prices because the geography is unforgiving. There's another edge: electronic tricks. AIS spoofing can put a hull where it isn't or hide one where it is. Jamming turns screens into guesses. A captain alongside a bend needs to know if that echo is steel or sea clutter. When the picture goes fuzzy, ships slow, and in a separation scheme, slow is contagious. Literal states invest in redundancy, shore-based radar, cameras, patrol eyes, but the ambiguity is a weapon, whether wielded by criminals or a state probing defenses. So the corridor builds layered deterrence without turning into a fortress. Patrols remain visible but predictable enough not to spook. Ports audit bunker suppliers to shrink the market for stolen fuel. Anchorages get lighting plans. Shipowners harden access points, install better CCTV, and brief crews on de-escalation. Pilots and controllers fold the threat environment into their mental models like weather, one more variable to respect and route around. Micro-stories keep it human. A second engineer tapes a locker latch that doesn't catch. That tiny fix keeps a thief from grabbing a critical spares kit. A Coast Guard petty officer pays for a fisherman's diesel after a chase damages a net. Next week, that fisherman calls in a skiff before it reaches a tanker. A drone operator on shore stares at a gray feed until, finally, the pixel that doesn't belong moves against the tide and he calls it in. None of those moments make headlines. All of them keep the throttle from being touched. Crime here isn't the main plot anymore, but it's the grit in the gears. Sabotage isn't daily, but it's plausible enough to plan around. Smuggling is background noise that can turn into a shout at the worst bend. The shadow threat doesn't close the strait. It slows hands, narrows margins, and raises the cost of every mistake. And in a place where time is money, and money is energy, and energy is politics, that shadow is leverage waiting for someone to use it. Navies in a corridor, accidents waiting to happen. While patrol boats trace the shoreline and pilots choreograph commerce, gray hulls slide through the same water with different rules. The US talks about freedom of navigation the way a pilot talks about safe water, as a habit that keeps options open. So destroyers and logistics ships thread Malacca and the Singapore Strait on tight schedules, deck crews at attention, helicopters lashed, radios busy. From a bridge, the difference between a 400-meter container ship and a 150-meter warship isn't just paint. It's how they turn, how they accelerate, and how they expect everyone else to read their body language. Across the map, Chinese frigates and intelligence vessels appear more often. Officially, it's transit and escort work, sometimes attached to anti-piracy missions bound for the Gulf of Aden. Unofficially, its presence, eyes and antennas noting who moves where, when, and with whom. A Chinese captain filing routine notifications still knows his ship's wake carries a message: we can be here too. India watches from the west, perched on the Andaman and Nicobar chain like a sentry over the gateway. Maritime patrol aircraft sweep the approaches, submarines slip in and out, and the Navy rehearses escort drills that start far out in the Bay of Bengal and end in waters one radio call from Singapore's controllers. The logic is simple. If anything threatens the flow east, it will pass this balcony first. Now layer exercises. Multinational drills stitch together ships that were strangers yesterday, a US destroyer, a Japanese escort, an Indian frigate, a Singaporean patrol craft, an Australian replenisher. The choreography looks crisp in a press release. On the water, it means formations turning through traffic lanes, while civilian ships still need pilots and tugs. A tanker captain sees 5 ships in a line and a gap that wasn't there a minute ago. A pilot mutters, "Hold your course," and trusts everyone else knows that's a promise, not a suggestion. Here's where near misses breed. Navies play games with signature and sensors, civilians just need predictability. Electronics complicate both. AIS is mandatory for merchants and optional for warships. Some turn it on, some don't, some spoof it. A box ship approaching a reporting point sees an echo without an identity and a speed that doesn't fit. The safest choice is to slow. The separation scheme absorbs the hesitation and passes it down like a baton. Grayzone tactics blur the edges more. A research vessel loiters near a bank longer than it needs to, cables over the side that might be sampling or mapping. A patrol aircraft runs a pattern that skims the top of a merchant lane, cameras pointed down. Radio calls are polite until they aren't. The legal lines, innocent passage, transit passage, safety of navigation, exist in books, but in the moment they're a voice tone and judgment. Micro story, dawn haze near 1 Fathom Bank. A Malaysian patrol boat shadows a Chinese survey ship working slow, 90 meters of steel with kit on deck. A US destroyer tracks both on passive sensors. Meanwhile, a southbound LNG carrier hits the bend on schedule, pilot aboard, tugs pre-briefed. The survey ship announces a turn for equipment adjustment. The patrol boat warns, maintain lane. The destroyer stays silent. The LNG captain sees a triangle closing and calls for 2 knots more to power through. A fishing skiff, blind to all of it, cuts across, dragging nets. For 20 seconds, 4 different logics collide. The pilot's voice goes flat, all ahead full, port 20. The ship clears by a ship length and a half. The survey ship completes its turn. The patrol eases off the throttle. The destroyer never speaks. Nobody files a protest. Everyone writes down the lesson. There's also simple fatigue. Naval crews run long watches on deployments that stretch months. A petty officer misreads a CPA by half a cable. A junior officer on a bridge wing trusts a radar plot over visual that looks wrong. Small errors matter more where the lane is tight. When a warship closes to inspect a suspicious contact, at the exact moment, a container ship begins a planned turn at a reporting point. Angles change faster than intentions. Electronic interference adds noise. A burst of jamming fuzzes VHF channels for 10 minutes on a busy afternoon. 2 ships repeat position reports. A third misses a call-in window and has to be re-cleared. A naval helicopter lowers to check a signal source and forces a feeder to give way in shallow water, bleeding speed it can't recover before the next bend. Nobody meant harm. The sum is delay and a little more stress. Accidents here don't need explosions. A warship's wake can push a tug's bow off a line at the worst second. A poorly briefed formation can drift a meter too far into the separation zone and make a cautious master tap brakes that don't exist. And in a marketplace that prices time, every naval message written on the water is read by insurers and schedulers as a variable. They adapt. Convoys requested by skittish charterers, daylight-only transits whispered between operators, escorts for LNG that weren't necessary yesterday. Each precaution is sensible and costly. The quiet truth on every bridge is this: navies think in signaling, merchants think in schedules. In Malacca, both must think in lanes. Competence keeps it together most days: calm voices, steady hands, shared drills that let a patrol boat and a pilot predict each other's moves. But the corridor doesn't forgive layered complexity. It magnifies it. And as more grey hulls claim their right to be seen, the room for misreading grows in waters that have no spare space for mistakes. The spark, plausible 72-hour crisis cascade. Day 1 starts quiet and then snaps. A fully laden product tanker loses power at a sill point where the lanes pinch and the set runs sideways. The pilot calls for tugs. One is 5 miles out, another tied up. The ship drifts, anchor splashes, chain runs, flukes skate over soft mud. The bow kisses a bank, the stern swings, and steel ends up lying just wrong, enough to intrude into both lanes. Controllers flatten their voices, reroute what they can, and within 30 minutes, AIS plots show 2 strings of vessels holding. What looks like a local grounding becomes geometry that stops the corridor. Stakes are immediate. Underkeel clearance shrinks with a falling tide, so salvors wait for the next flood to try a pull. A drone checks hull shape, tugs check bollard pull. Meanwhile, the queue stretches. A gas carrier decides to hold north of 1 fathom bank rather than creep. 2 VLCCs choose to drift in deeper water. At the eastern approach, pilots start issuing speed advisories, turning arrivals into a holding pattern. Insurance desks flag major incident, awaits salvage outcome. The first call from a refinery scheduler lands like a drumbeat. We may miss crude intake by 24 hours. Action flows in rings. Littoral states activate a joint channel. Patrol boats establish a safety corridor inside what water remains, tugs reposition, and a salvage master draws a plan on a whiteboard stained with old oil. The grounded crew vents ballast to lift the stern a hair. On the second tide, wires sing, prop wash boils silt, and nothing moves. Controllers broadcast a firm line, no unauthorized attempts to squeeze by. That sentence costs millions and buys safety. Impact hits screens before noon. Oil futures jump on rumor first, then on math. LNG spot prices quiver. 2 carriers accept diversion to Lombok with slot penalties in East Asia. Charterers scramble for available tonnage. Owners hold out, smelling a rate surge. A Singapore bunkering house tells clients to spread arrivals. A Malaysian port pauses night entries to avoid compounding risk in haze. By sundown, the queue is a fact, not a fear. Day 2 changes shape. Opportunists nudge the edges. A pair of skiffs boards an anchored bulker off Dumai. Nothing dramatic, just siphoned diesel and missing spares. Enough though for 2 shipowners to instruct masters, daylight anchorages only. Insurers revise clauses for high-risk holds. Premiums tick up for those waiting near the pinch points. Patrols tighten loops, tired crews add a third watch, and the cost of caution climbs. Stakes for markets grow teeth. Refineries that hoped for a short delay start cutting runs by a few points to stretch feedstock. A utility planner in South Korea authorizes higher coal burn for the evening peak. A Japanese gas buyer calls Qatar to confirm flexibility. The answer is yes at a price. Freight rates for east of Suez crude spike. A broker laughs into a phone and then quotes triple yesterday's number. The laughter isn't joy, it's tension finding a valve. Action at the casualty shifts to engineering. Divers confirm no breach. The bow sits deep in a soft bank. Salvors rig high-capacity pumps to strip more ballast, order a second tug with more pull, and request a temporary safety exclusion zone wide enough to let them angle the hull. The window is the next flood, and everyone knows it. Harbor masters rehearse the reopening sequence on paper, priority for gas, then tankers, then boxes, knowing reality will argue back. Impact rolls through supply chains by afternoon. A Vietnamese electronics plant moves to a Saturday shift. Parts are late. A Thai auto line burns buffer stock and emails a gentle warning to dealers. Retailers in Australia get rationing advisories from distribution centers. 2-day delay on home appliances. Prioritize prepaid orders. Factories do what they can. Air freight small high-value parts. Reschedule truck slots. Promise overtime. The real cost is time nobody can print. Day 3 brings decisions with headlines. A few ships peel off for Sunda and Lombok, adding days and fuel they'll try to pass to customers. Governments tap reserves at the edges, nothing loud, just a quiet draw to calm refineries. Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia hold a joint press briefing, coordinated salvage, security, and traffic management, no need for external intervention. The phrasing is careful and meant to lower blood pressure. Stakes step into politics. International navies offer assistance. The gatekeepers reply, "We've got this," while welcome limited liaison. Too many grey hulls near a tense salvage site is how near misses are born. Insurance markets hold their breath, rating agencies draft notes, and commodity desks argue whether the spike is a blip or a trend. Action peaks at the tide. Salvors light off pumps, tugs take strain, and the pilot aboard calls engine orders in a voice that sounds like any other day. A degree here, a notch there, wire groans, mud lets go, and the ship inches. For a long 20 seconds, nothing happens, and then it does. The stern slides, the bow eases, and a corridor reappears where there wasn't one 5 minutes ago. Controllers open lanes in pulses, pilots stack priorities, and tugs babysit the wounded ship to safe water. Impact ripples fast. Markets shave back the spike. LNG diversions stay diverted. Timetables adjust. The queue begins to unwind, not as fast as anyone wants, but faster than the darkest models feared. Factories keep overtime, retailers smooth messaging, and planners jot down one more lesson. It doesn't take malice to test a system built on minutes. And while this spark was an accident, everyone felt how easily intent could have worn the same mask. Blockade and counter-blockade, war by other means. The grounding cleared, but a new phrase starts creeping into briefings: enhanced inspections. No one says blockade, they don't have to. A literal state tightens safety checks at a narrow bend, citing recent incidents. Boarding teams count life jackets, measure freeboard, ask for duplicate manifests. Each visit is lawful on paper and slow in practice. 10 ships an hour becomes 5. Schedules bend, markets notice. Stakes jump from seamanship to sovereignty. If one state can slow a corridor by invoking safety, who decides when it stops? Energy importers upstream feel the squeeze first. LNG carriers can't loiter. Boil-off gas is physics, not politics. Every hour held at anchor erodes fuel and optionality. A queue that looks like prudence from shore looks like rationing from a power plant watching reserves tick down. Action plays out in forms that avoid headlines. Electronic haze thickens. AIS anomalies flare near critical reporting points. 2 ships appear to occupy the same patch of water, neither quite where they should be. Radio checks go unanswered for a beat too long. A merchant's GPS jumps 50 meters sideways for a minute, just enough to force a pilot to slow and reacquire bearings with buoys and eyeballs. Nobody claims responsibility. Everyone adjusts speed. Impact is leverage priced in hours. Freight rates surge again, not because steel is scarce, but because time is being taxed. Charterers write new clauses, subject to inspection delay. Insurers shade risk models toward caution. A refinery with a tight crude slate swaps to pricier grades that can be sourced via longer routes. Margins evaporate to buy certainty. Governments whose citizens don't care about transit passage care very much about electricity bills. Meanwhile, naval planners avoid the B word and talk about assurance. Convoys for certain cargoes are proposed quietly. Escorts would wait outside the most constricted stretches, shepherd a group through, then peel away. It's legal, it's visible, and it says, "We're watching." Literal authorities bristle at the implication and respond with their own escorts. Our pilots, our patrols, our water. The choreography gets crowded, the message carefully ambiguous. What nobody knew at the time is which levers were being tested. A Grayzone inspection regime can be mounted with administrative tools and a few extra boats, but the fog that makes it bite comes from electronics and rumor. A single reported mine-like object, quickly cleared, buys a day of caution. A burst of jamming at dusk creates confusion that justifies daylight-only transits for a week. Each decision is reasonable on its own. Together they slow commerce like a headwind. Countermeasures evolve fast. Shippers coordinate arrivals to build critical mass, timing 4 LNG carriers to present a united schedule. If one is inspected, all insist on equal treatment, turning a targeted slowdown into a public logjam the inspecting authority doesn't want to own. Energy ministries quietly prioritize green lanes for gas and refined products, trading diplomatic IOUs for velocity. Singapore amplifies its neutrality by publishing real-time passage metrics, transparency as antidote to manipulation. Stakes sharpen around law. UNCLOS says transit passage shall not be impeded. It also lets coastal states adopt sea lane and traffic separation schemes and enforce safety. Lawyers begin drafting memos that will never see daylight, parsing words like unnecessary. If an equipment verification takes 90 minutes, is that necessary? If it takes 4 hours, the answer depends on who is asking and who is paying. Action at sea gets inventive. A suspected spoofing cluster prompts a coalition of willing states to deploy additional coastal radar and optical systems, fusing data ashore and pumping verified tracks back to pilots over secure channels. That reduces the value of electronic harassment by restoring confidence in the picture. A merchant captain feels it as a calm voice. Verified echo bearing 180, range 2 cables, speed 9. Maintain course. Impact boomerangs. The slow rollers discover that pain is contagious. Cargoes start to route around not just Malacca, but particular stretches inside it. Lombok and Macassar see more traffic earlier than expected. Ports downrange that wanted a share of the flow get a surge they can't handle, revealing their own bottlenecks. Traders who engineered the slowdown profit on the spike and then lose it when alternatives settle into new patterns. Market manipulation pays until it doesn't. Meanwhile, littoral states hedge. They convene a joint review board to standardize safety checks across their waters, shrinking the space for one actor to weaponize compliance. If a boarding is warranted, they set time caps and post them publicly. They invite neutral observers for credibility. It's bureaucratic jiu-jitsu, use procedure to blunt procedure. Counter-blockade thinking creeps in from the edges. If gas is slowed in one direction, what can be slowed in the other without crossing a line? Instead of ships, it's paper. Export clearances for critical minerals linger a day. Customs scans for rare earth magnets find anomalies that must be rescanned. Again, legal, again slow, and again a message. Vulnerability isn't one way. The human layer feels the strain. Pilots juggle convoys, inspections, and weather with less sleep. Boarding teams stand longer watches, professionalism tested by suspicion on both sides. A master takes a breath before a clipboard hits his gangway, reminding himself that anger buys nothing but more delay. On shore, schedulers spin worst-case wheels and draft contingency plans labeled "only if asked." This was the moment everything changed, not in a bang but in a tempo. The corridor learned how easily time could be turned into a weapon and how quickly transparency, coordination, and quiet firmness could blunt it. No one called it a blockade. Everyone behaved as if one might be next. The escape routes: Sunda, Lombok, Macassar, and beyond. When Malacca coughs, charts come out and fingers slide south and east. The first question is simple: how deep, how far, how fast? Sunda sits closest, a notch between Java and Sumatra with romance in its name and limits in its water. Depths hover around 20 meters across much of the sill. A careful master can nurse a Suezmax through, but a VLCC pushes margins thin. Cross-currents at the Narrows, volcano peaks on both sides, fishing fleets that work like they own the tide. They all turn a deviation into a negotiation. Lombok answers differently. East of Bali and west of Sumbawa, the water drops off like a cliff. Depths plunge past 200 meters, and then some, a straight-through route where draft isn't the problem, distance is. The Indonesian throughflow squeezes there, a river of sea running north-south that can twist a ship's track if you don't account for it. But for LNG carriers with schedules and VLCCs with bellies they don't want to lighten, Lombok looks like relief at the cost of days. Macassar is the longer bet, north-south between Borneo and Sulawesi, a corridor that pulls traffic into the heart of the archipelago and then out through the Celebes and Philippine seas. It's deep, it's wide, and it shifts the whole geometry of a voyage. East Asia-bound cargoes accept an arc that adds fuel and time, then rejoin crowded waters near Luzon or Taiwan with a logbook bruised by extra miles. Captains like the sea room. Owners feel the bunker burn. Stakes at this fork aren't academic. Every added day is crew overtime, fuel at today's spot price, and a charter party clause that either bites or lets you pass the cost. A container line that flips 2 strings to Lombok finds that ports downstream don't have pilots rated for that draft in those approaches at that frequency. Tug fleets sized for routine suddenly look small. Bunkering supply chains built around Singapore's rhythm can't replicate quality and volume on short notice in alternate anchorages. The map suggests relief, the system reveals gaps. Action looks like routing sprints. Operators form crisis cells and rebuild schedules ship by ship. Shift the gas long and the crude early, a fleet manager says, pencil tapping day numbers. LNG goes first through Lombok because boil-off is unforgiving and downstream regas slots are booked to the hour. Oil follows, staggered and swapped. Boxes split, high value via deviation, lower priority hold for clearance. In Jakarta, port authorities work phones to line up pilots who know Lombok's set at spring tide and Macassar's rain squalls at dusk. Impact unfolds in patches. Sunda takes small craft and mid-sized tankers with patience. Traffic density rises, and so do VHF complaints about nets across channel edges. Lombok swells with deep draft traffic that hasn't seen those coasts in years. Local fishermen watch wakes that dwarf their boats and adapt the hard way. Macassar hums with ships that radio in a practiced calm and crews that sleep a little less. Downrange, Darwin and Port Hedland see strange flags fueling, a reminder that choke points migrate in a crisis. Depth and draft dictate choices. VLCCs that would have shaved cargo to fit Malacca can now sail full through Lombok, but the math isn't simple. Longer voyage, higher fuel burn, and a slot at a discharge port that might not flex. LNG captains check metocean models for the through-flow's mood. A 2-knot set off the beam changes approach times by hours. Masters call ahead for tug horsepower at ports that don't carry Singapore's bench strength, and they brief crews to expect less choreography, more improvisation. Distance penalties stack. An extra 7 or 8 days on a Middle East to Northeast Asia run means crews hit contract thresholds and owners negotiate relief or bonuses on the fly. A box ship's weekly loop becomes 10-day turns, forcing carriers to add ships they don't have. A chemical tanker misses a window at a specialized berth and sits outside for 3 days, burning low loads and patience. Schedulers build new cadences. Wednesday ETA becomes the following Friday, and truckers and warehouses scramble to meet a tide that moved on paper and didn't in asphalt. Chokepoints don't disappear, they relocate. Lombok's wide, but exits funnel into narrower cuts, the Ombiweta passages if you push farther east, or the shallower sills around the Flores Sea if you swing back. Macassar spills north into the busy Luzon Strait or east into waters that flirt with typhoon tracks. Risk shifts from grounding to weather, from collision in crowds to fatigue in long legs. Insurance underwriters change their spreadsheets. Pirate risk down, storm exposure up, pilotage risk traded for underkeel certainty. Port readiness outside Singapore becomes the quiet limiter. Do they have the bollard pull? Do they have enough linesmen at 2 in the morning? Is the bunker fuel clean, standards aligned, paperwork digital? A fouled injector from bad fuel in a place without spare parts is how an engine fails at the next bend. Owners with long memories pay for quality. Others learn why the cheapest bunkers are sometimes the most expensive decision you can make. Bottleneck migration shows up in complaints from places that never asked for this spotlight. A harbor master in Surabaya fields calls from captains insisting on priority because their deviation was for the global good. He answers with a list: pilot at 6, tide at 8, tugs at 9, that's your slot. In Darwin, a quayside foreman watches an LNG carrier request, services his port can't offer at that frequency, and calls a meeting. Resilience on a map takes time to build on a pier. If you can't go around forever, you start thinking through. Engineers revive old files labeled canal and rail and land bridge. But on the water, the answer in a pinch is simpler: disperse, slow, and keep people fresh. The escape routes work, expensively, imperfectly, and only as long as the stress doesn't turn every alternative into another choke point. Hedging on land, pipelines, rails, and canals that weren't. When sea lanes tighten, planners turn their maps over and ask the ground for help. The answer usually starts with a line and ends with a caveat. The Myanmar corridor was supposed to be one of those answers. Steel pipes from Kayakbu to Yunnan, one for gas, one for crude, cutting a shortcut around Malacca. On paper, it trims days. In practice, it trims volume. The gas line moves steady cubic meters that matter to cities in China's southwest. The crude line feeds refineries inland. But tanker math wins on scale. Every pipeline barrel is a barrel that didn't sweat the sill, yet both lines together are a fraction of a day's tanker flow. Terrain adds teeth: mountains, landslides, corrosion crews who hike to leaks. Politics adds the rest: a civil war that shifts front lines across rights of way, local anger over land and compensation, and saboteurs who've learned that a single charge can stop a country's plan for a week. Rails promise rhythm. The Trans-Eurasian links, trains threading from China through Kazakhstan and Russia to Europe, turned into pandemic-era relief valves for containers. High-value cargo rode steel wheels past congested ports, but energy doesn't fit well on trains across continents. LNG isn't going in boxcars, and crude rail works only over shorter arcs with specialized loading that few terminals own. Containers that do ride pay a premium and move niche slices of trade. A micromanager in a Chongqing warehouse remembers shifting electronics to rail to save a factory schedule. It worked. The same fix won't run a grid or fuel a refinery. Then there's the canal that keeps resurrecting itself in meetings. The The Tai Kra Canal, an idea that predates steam. Dig a cut across the narrowest part of the Malay Peninsula, bypass Malacca, and move the choke inland. Engineers sketch locks, cuts, spoil disposal, financiers sketch tolls, environmentalists sketch destroyed fisheries and mangroves, diplomats sketch naval flags lining a new throat. Costs balloon. Domestic politics in Thailand change tempo. The canal's map looks clean, the country's map doesn't. Each time the idea surfaces, it meets the same coalition. Fishermen who know what dredging does, neighbors who hear canal and think bases, treasuries that read hundreds of billions and think bridges and schools first. A lighter, flashier cousin appears, the land bridge, ports on Thailand's coasts, highways and rails between them, and cranes moving boxes from Indian Ocean to Gulf of Thailand. It avoids the dig, keeps the toll, and claims speed. The catch is transfer. Containers hate being touched. Every lift is time, cost, and risk. Congested yards become parking lots. Truckers strike for rates that match promises. A typhoon on one coast halves throughput. It's a hedge, not a replacement, and it works only if both ends and the road behave like a single port. That takes years of boring investment and a political truce with geography. Indonesia's ideas stay closer to home. Land bridges on Java and Sumatra to shortcut around congested straits, port clusters to spread calls, and special zones to coax logistics to the islands that often watch trade pass by. They help. A port deepens a berth and adds a tug. A yard adds reefer plugs. A bridge shaves hours for trucks. But the archipelago's scale resists neatness. Ferries run late. Roads wash out. A pilot trained for Malacca might not be rated for the cross-currents at a smaller cut. Partial relief, not a panacea. Storage buys time when routes can't buy speed. LNG tanks near cities and crude caverns inland let utilities and refineries ride out a hiccup. Strategic reserves are comfort food on a policy shelf. But storage is a stopwatch, not a pipeline. Days or weeks, depending on appetite and planning. Then the clock hits zero and everyone stares back at ships. On whiteboards, numbers do the talking. A pipeline's diameter, a pump's horsepower, a train's axle load, a canal's lock width. On the water, it's one VLCC passing Phillips Channel at dawn. Land hedges can blunt shocks and shift some flows, but none replace that ship. The trick is layering. A few 100,000 barrels a day through Myanmar. A box corridor that absorbs high-value goods for a month. A land bridge that trims a loop for certain services. New LNG tanks timed to winter peaks. Together, they turn a crisis into a manageable mess. The politics never leave the room. A canal invites foreign interest, a land bridge invites competition, a pipeline invites sabotage, a rail line invites sanctions risk through countries whose relations swing with seasons. Every hedge takes partners, and partners bring leverage. The question planners whisper isn't, can we build it? It's who turns the valve when it matters. Here's the quiet lesson after each scare. Resilience isn't poured in a hurry. It's trained into crews, negotiated into contracts, budgeted into tanks, and argued into corridors that survive elections. The projects that weigh-ant, canals on glossy brochures, rails that were supposed to carry energy, bridges that promised to erase geography, still shape the conversation by reminding everyone what, instead of Malacca, really costs. So the hedge becomes humility. Build what helps. Admit what won't. Spread risk across sea, land, and storage without pretending the land can swallow the sea. In a world that breathes through narrow water, the smartest backstop is 1,000 small, boring decisions that make the next spark less of a fire. The human chain, mariners, pilots, and ports under stress. When the lane tightens, steel isn't the first thing that bends. People do. A master walks up the bridge ladder at 30, coffee in one hand, a tide table in the other, building the day in his head while the ship hums underfoot. He's counting windows, pilot boarding, tug rendezvous, berth readiness, and subtracting fatigue. He knows the math works until it doesn't. Pilotage is where the strain shows first. Pilots live by the clock and the tide, a rotating puzzle of call-outs, rest limits, and weather that laughs at schedules. A haze week compresses windows, and suddenly the roster runs hot. A pilot finishes a high-load departure in crosswind, downs a sandwich at the terminal, and steps onto a ladder for an inbound LNG with barely an hour of head on the sleep bank. Training keeps judgment clean. But the voice on the radio gets shorter, the jokes vanish, and decisions move from conversational to clipped. Tug crews ride the same compression. Tow lanes snap if angles are sloppy, and sloppy is what fatigue breeds. A tug master who's done 4 assists in sheer winds lines up for a 5th with a ship that's bigger and a berth that's tighter. He briefs quick, line on quarter, slow pull, watch prop wash. The deckhand checks gloves twice because he's seen a line take a finger. The choreography works because repetition welded it into muscle. But repetition also dulls edges, and supervisors watch for the glaze that precedes mistakes. Crew changes are the quiet fault line. Visas late, flights cancelled, medicals expired, one missed handover, and a ship carries a crew 2 weeks past their plan. Morale drops a notch each day after that. A second engineer who thought he'd be home for a daughter's birthday watches another sunrise off Port Dickson and says nothing, because saying it makes it heavier. Masters email agents. Any update on sign-off? Agents answer with apologies and screenshots. The machine keeps moving, the people keep grinding. Ports are clocks made of concrete and people. Berth windows are promises, and yard planners juggle stacks labeled with the future, transshipment connections that hit or miss by hours. When the lane slows, those stacks turn into chess. A scheduler with 3 screens and a headset moves colored blocks across a grid and hears 20 versions of urgency per hour. We'll miss the rail cutoff if we slip. Our reefer plugs are full by midnight. He trims minutes where he can. A gang starts early, a crane shifts boom faster by 2 beats. A truck queue extends 30 more meters into a lane that was supposed to stay clear. Inland, the stress leaks into asphalt. Truckers wait at gates that open and close like lungs. A driver on his second night run in a week calculates whether he can legally make a double turn with mandatory rest. Dispatchers add a note. Expect delay on return, yard at 90%. Warehouse teams prep cross-docks with tape on floors to choreograph human traffic like ship traffic. Keep the flow, avoid the crush. Microstory catches the human scale. A port scheduler in Johor flips through a stack of delayed sailings at 2 a.m. One box ship needs a high tide, one tanker wants a daylight-only approach, one feeder threatens to drop a call if pushed past dawn. He looks at the weather radar, sees a squall line that will knock an hour out of the plan, and calls a pilot to ask for 5 minutes here, 10 there. It's negotiation as craft. Later, he texts his wife, "Be home after breakfast." She knows that means lunch. Training is the line between tired and unsafe. Simulators run blackouts on repeat. A container ship loses steering at a bend. A pilot calls a tug to push on the shoulder. The master orders engine to dead slow. The helmsman keeps calm hands. Crews rehearse musters in languages layered over each other. Orders short, gestures universal. The drills feel like theater until a night when they aren't, and a bosun who rolled his eyes last month moves faster than he thought he could. Labor contracts are pressure valves and timers. A union steward watches overtime hours accumulate and keeps a ledger that can become a strike ballot. Nobody wants to be the one who stops the lane. Nobody wants to normalize exhaustion. Negotiations click forward, meal breaks enforced, bunkering windows adjusted, mandatory rest honored even when the tide begs otherwise. Management grumbles about cost. Safety officers nod because they've seen what cutting corners buys. The quiet heroics are small and constant. A cadet brings tea unasked at the exact minute a pilot's voice cracks. A linesman on a rain-slick pier plants his feet and holds a hawser that wants to run. A yard planner offers a crane driver an extra 10 minutes to stretch his back before a heavy bay. A Coast Guard coxswain declines a TV interview because he prefers more patrol fuel over a headline. Meanwhile, the system pays for thin margins. A single absent fitter means a planned engine check slips. That slip becomes a gamble in the next heavy set. A fatigue checker misses a misdeclared hazardous box. The miss becomes a close call in a stack when a reefer unit overheats. These aren't scandals, they're reminders that capacity isn't metal. It's sleep, training, and trust laid over infrastructure. Under stress, communication becomes safety. Calm words repeated back, pilot on board, tug fast on quarter, heave away 4. The cadence steadies hands that shake. Radios carry more than instructions, they carry tone. A clipped proceed can escalate, a measured stand by, you're next, can keep a bridge from making a bad decision. In the end, the lane's resilience is human. The tools matter, radar, tugs, cranes, but the choices in tired heads matter more. When the corridor is a rumor away from slowing, it's the people who lengthen the fuse, the pilot who takes one less job, the master who waits one more hour for light, the scheduler who rebuilds a day in 5-minute blocks. The human chain is the throttle and the safeguard stretched tight, but not yet frayed. The silent costs, inflation, inventories, and energy security. When a corridor like this tightens, the first numbers to move aren't ships. They're prices. Freight quotes jump by noon. Procurement teams open spreadsheets that look calm and start adding surcharges that don't. A $2,000 container becomes $2,600. A day of bunker burn becomes 3. The increases look temporary on a chart and permanent in a household budget once they reach a store shelf. Just-in-time breaks quietly. Inventory days, once a point of pride, balloon. A retailer that held 18 days of stock watches it creep to 27, then 35. Each extra day is capital turned into cardboard and floor space. CFOs reprice risk with a pencil that cuts friendly. Safety stock becomes policy, carrying costs compound, and discounts to clear old SKUs arrive late because replacements aren't where they should be. The cost isn't just the price, it's the time money sits still. Factories absorb shock like lungs take air until they can't. An auto line that needed 4 shipments a week now gets 3. Finished vehicles stack in yards, 98% complete, missing chips worth dollars that hold up cars worth tens of thousands. Managers negotiate sequence changes, build what we have parts for, promise customers the rest will arrive soon. Soon becomes weeks, cash conversion cycles slip, and credit lines shoulder the lag. Energy makes the math sharper. When LNG is late, utilities don't debate. They light coal. Emissions spike as a rounding error in global graphs and a headline in local politics. Gas peakers that should bridge summer peaks sit idle while coal units run hard into the night. The cost isn't just environmental. It's contractual, penalties for missed gas offtake on one side, penalties for missed power delivery on the other. Somebody pays twice to keep the lights on. Inflation hides in logistics before it shows in food. A fridge carried across oceans costs more to move. The supplier trims warranty budgets or raises list price. A grocery chain, strung by 2 weeks of delayed reefers, hedges by paying extra for air freight on high-margin produce and passes the rest along. Poor countries can't hedge like that. Foreign exchange reserves shrink, fuel subsidies strain, and a half-point shift in freight becomes a full point on staple prices. Boardrooms change posture. What was buzzword last year, friendshoring, dual sourcing, regional hubs, becomes a slide with dates and spend. A sneaker brand that lived by a single mold shop in one province builds a twin 2 time zones away. A pharma company that relied on a handful of active ingredient plants rotates contracts through an extra supplier and accepts slightly worse unit economics. Investors ask about resilience like they used to ask about growth. The answer's cost, and the cost lands on consumers. A micro-story, a mid-tier electronics assembler in Penang holds a daily stand-up. The planner opens with freight, 2 containers stuck south of Singapore, 1 diverted via Lombok, ETA plus 4 days. The buyer says the capacitor vendor is willing to airlift a partial, but at triple rate. The plant manager decides, build down inventory on 3 models, pause a 4th, and reassign crews. Payroll stays whole, output drops 8% this week. He leans back and mutters, cheaper than losing a customer. It is, and it still hurts. Insurers price behavior. A spike in minor boardings at anchorages nudges war risk, add-ons up even if no shot is fired. P&I clubs widen deductibles in heightened vigilance zones. The language is neutral, the invoices aren't. Small carriers pay more because they lack scale, then charge more because they must. Large carriers hold their nerve longer and take market share. Consolidation accelerates on the back of a geography problem. Governments try to smooth. Strategic stocks trickle into markets to calm refiners. Export controls on staples appear, meant to stabilize domestic shelves and guaranteed to destabilize neighbors. A finance minister calls central bank colleagues and talks about imported inflation with the tone of someone discussing whether inevitable, unkind, and beyond her full control. A fuel subsidy expanded in haste takes a year to unwind without protests. Hedging and hoarding split paths. Smart hedging is storage and alternate contracts signed in peace for use in storms. Hoarding is the panic version, double orders, block cancellations, empty warehouses waiting for ghosts that never arrive. The first buys time. The second creates the very shortage it fears by clogging yards and starving others. Policymakers try to distinguish prudent buffers from fear-driven stockpiles. The distinction blurs on contact with politics. Energy security gets redefined in meetings nobody televises. It's no longer just barrels and BTUs. It's days of cover, flexibility clauses, dual-fuel power plants able to swing in 24 hours. Utilities reopen files on gas-to-coal switching protocols, not because they want to, but because their winter depends on being able to. Energy traders, watching spreads, earn in the confusion. Regulators, watching fairness, threaten, and then moderate, because heat and light outrank neat models in cold months. There's a quieter cost, trust. When a schedule becomes a suggestion, contracts become negotiations. A buyer who spent 10 years squeezing suppliers for pennies now pays dollars to keep loyalty. A shipper that hid behind force majeure 2 seasons ago finds fewer friends this season. Relationships reprice along with freight, and the soft tissue of commerce, reliance, expectation, grace, scarifies. By the time the lane breathes again, the bill has already spread. Sticker prices inch, wages chase, central banks tighten, growth forecasts shave points. None of it looks dramatic on a single morning. All of it feels heavier by year's end. The shock wasn't a headline. It was a slow leak that made everything cost a little more, arrive a little later, and pollute a little higher. In a world calibrated to minutes, that's an inflation engine disguised as weather. Who controls the throttle, power maps, and leverage? Start with geography. Littoral states hold the keys closest to the lock. Singapore wields soft power through competence, neutral, predictable, and indispensable. Malaysia and Indonesia possess the legal levers and street-level enforcement that set the corridor's tempo. Together, they can slow or smooth without speeches. China holds exposure and presence, not jurisdiction. India's balcony at Andaman and Nicobar is leveraged by location. The US and allies project blue water assurance and write the maritime rulebook most actors still use. None can dictate alone. Private hands tilt the dials daily. Insurers, P&I clubs, charterers, and commodity traders price time and risk, steering behavior faster than diplomats. A surcharge or a clause can move a fleet. Power here isn't a switch. It's layered nudges, law, pilots, premiums, patrols. The throttle belongs to coordination, which means everyone and no one runs it. Resolution and meaning. In this corridor, control is a myth. Coordination is the only currency that clears the channel. If you want the deeper story of how chokepoints compound, Suez, Hormuz, and the silent math that links them, watch the next episode. Subscribe for more untold geography shaping your day and see who's planning for the double shock before it arrives.